Valentin Gladkich, a political analyst at the United Ukraine Center, is on direct line with us. Valentin, congratulations.
Good night. How do you assess what is happening in both Russia and Azerbaijan? What provoked it? Well, because it was obviously not an urgent need to raise a 25-year-old case. It was not the police who rounded up the Azerbaijanis in Yekaterinburg. As far as I remember, it was the FSB. That is, it was some kind of special operation that was being prepared in great detail. What kind of signal was this to Aliyev? I tend to think that it was not a signal to Aliyev. I tend to think that this is the result of internal political, perhaps even criminal, showdowns in the Russian Federation. But it is clear that since they touched on a fairly influential Azerbaijani diaspora, which in turn, I am sure, is strongly connected with the ruling regime in Azerbaijan, it would be strange if Azerbaijan did not react to this and did not intervene in the situation. Well, and then this escalating course of this conflict simply began. Well, but it is unlikely that this will end with any serious consequences for, well, purely interstate relations. Here, colleagues have already simply said that the trajectory of development, well, of Russia and the former republics of the Soviet Union, well, it is not determined by such conflicts, but by much more powerful factors. After all, I want to remind you that at one time Georgians in Russia were simply loaded onto cargo planes like cattle and deported from Russia. And this does not prevent the Georgians from kissing the Russians on the lips and helping them to circumvent sanctions, and helping them to wage war against Ukraine on a large scale, because a specific political regime has been formed there. Therefore, we must also be aware of these things here. As the classic said, a falcon loaded with gold will take any fortress. But the fact is that Azerbaijan has enough gold. Well, Russia today has much fewer tools to influence its power in Azerbaijan. And we understand that in fact the center of gravity for Baku today is not Moscow, but a slightly different capital, and the capital of a state that is much more powerful than the Russian Federation, and is a member of NATO. Yes, and this idea of pan-Turkism, it has not disappeared anywhere. And Mr. Erdogan, in his, well, authoritarian style of government, and in his worldview, well, I think, he is definitely not inferior to Russia. It's just that, unlike today's Russia, today's Turkey has certain tools and resources. Therefore, I am inclined to think, and I hope, I will not hide this. I hope that, this story will deepen the conflict between Azerbaijan and Russia and that, well, the Russian spirit will become less and less. Well, and I hope that what happened to Georgia will not happen to Azerbaijan. Well, and also in this context I would like to mention the situation in Armenia, well, where there are also their own, well, frankly anti-Russian tendencies. Let's put it this way. And we talked about this, I think, and after the start of the full-scale invasion, that Russia's positions in the post-Soviet space will weaken due to objective reasons, because they really lack resources, because they threw all their resources into the conquest of Ukraine. And no matter how paradoxical it may be, even today, resisting Russian aggression, the Russian, well, army, if this gang of gangs can be called an army, which is staffed, in particular, by representatives of various indigenous peoples of the Russian Federation, well, we are essentially, again, paradoxically, contributing to the fact that they can gain independence from Moscow sooner or later. Such are the paradoxes of history.
Well, let's talk about Armenia. We will get to it, but about Azerbaijan. What could this result in? Because you talked about the Russian spirit. So the Russian house was closed there earlier in Azerbaijan. In fact, the tone of the press, which is absolutely subordinate to the central government, has also changed about Ukraine. Putin is already being called a dictator. They show destroyed Ukrainian houses, the results of bombings, that is, well, such, pro-Russian caution is becoming less. But what is happening in Russia? They are packing Azerbaijanis there. In Azerbaijan, they detained, in addition to those propagandists from Sputnik, the organ of influence of the Russian government abroad. Obviously, everyone there knew that these people had been working in Azerbaijan for decades, that they were FSB employees. But they didn't touch them. But they also started arresting ordinary Russians who actually fled from Putin's regime abroad to avoid being mobilized. But now they are lumping everyone under one roof, accusing them of drug trafficking. Well, there are cadres with terrible experiences on their faces. So what could this lead to? There is an Azerbaijani business in Russia of a Russian oligarch called Lukoil. Obviously, there are also Russian interests in Azerbaijan. How far can it go, remembering the support, for example, from Erdogan?
Well, I am inclined not to think that the Russians will let go, to put it so vulgarly, that is, they will make any efforts to de-escalate this conflict. And I am inclined to think that it is certainly normalizing at some level. But what does it mean to normalize? It will be like the famous saying, those who remember the past, therefore its eye is gone, and those who forget, therefore their dwelling. Therefore, yes, as it were, spoons will be found, but the sediment will remain. I repeat that this is justified and explained, is not determined by this particular case. This is explained by the general trend of the policy that is being implemented by Russia and other subjects in the post-Soviet space. That is, Russia has lost, its monopoly right. Yes, that is, all these pathetic claims that this is its exclusive zone of influence there. Everything, even if it looks funny, because it has not been like that for a long time. And again, in order to implement some policy, you need to have the resources for that. Today, in many republics of the former Soviet Union, despite the fact that yes, there are Russian agents, Russian business, and all these, scoops, homo sovieticus who remained there, those who are conditionally called cotton electorate there, or as they are called in Latvia, Urla, and Russian-speaking cattle, I apologize for the, maybe, not parliamentary term, as they say, from the song you can't throw out a word. Yes, all these elements exist and they are certainly used by Russia in order to influence the domestic political situation in many, countries, and not only in the post-Soviet space, but in the post-Soviet space to a greater extent. But today, other entities are also working effectively in these territories, which have much more resources at their disposal. And moreover, as you showed in this Azerbaijani television story, we must understand that there is still a certain everyday situation and a certain everyday attitude. And indeed there are statistics. There is a recent book published in Ukrainian about language practices in the Soviet Union. And there are statistics on how many Russians spoke the languages of the indigenous peoples, the republics in which they lived. If we talk about, the Caucasian republics, then their such a, share reached barely 10%. I think that Azerbaijanis remember this perfectly well. How the Russians treated them throughout this history of contacts with them. And despite some official discourse there, we must understand that at the everyday level, it was somewhat different. And they are culturally different, and religiously different, and business-wise they are oriented towards other centers. Therefore, all these stories about brotherly nations, about all this other delusional pathos, that doesn't work like that in life. Therefore, Russia will lose its positions, again, while maintaining existing trends. And I repeat, the key point will still be the results of the war in Ukraine. That is, if the war in Ukraine ends in our favor, it will open up a huge space of opportunity for many other nations. If, God forbid, it happens that Russia's positions will strengthen, well, then I think that, yes, Azerbaijan also needs to take a little bit of the cue as an object of aggression. Well, although, again, I think that Azerbaijan will not be in the first rows of this queue. Again, due to the fact that there is Erdogan, there is Turkey, there is the concept of pan-Turkism, there are interests of other strong powers of this world in Azerbaijan. That is, Azerbaijan will not be an easy target for Russia. It must be understood that Russia will use Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia. Well, in order to constantly stir up these quarrels there, incite some interethnic conflicts, interreligious conflicts, fuel terrorist organizations. If they don't exist, they will create them there, yes, some radical Islamic organizations there, they will support some mafia structures in order to destabilize the situation. That is, the Russians are doing all this beautifully. Well, and in Europe too. Let's not be cunning and turn a blind eye to it.
And you don't remember Kazakhstan?
No, that's what I'm saying, the post-Soviet space. Kazakhstan itself is just, well, Kazakhstan, again.
There's also, you know, a whole region that the Russian-speaking population will protect.
Let the Russian-speaking population protect Grozny for a start. Yes, then protect the Russian-speaking population. When they are protected in Grozny, then it will be possible to protect them somewhere in other cities, right? They can even protect them in Moscow, where they can be protected somewhere in Rostov. Well, where, strictly speaking, they really don't put them in anything there and they do whatever they want. And we see an endless stream of these scandals, videos, when some characters who came down from the mountains, yes, tell the indigenous Russians how to live in their own state, although what is their property? So, what I'm getting at is that when we talk about Kazakhstan, well, yes, in Kazakhstan, just like in many other republics, there is something to rely on. But we must understand that Kazakhstan has long ceased to be Russia's backyard, where they can do whatever they want. The interests of China are also represented there. The interests of Great Britain, large transnational corporations are also represented there. Well, we must understand that local political regimes have learned to balance risks. Well, that is, they also try to be, at least, dependent on Russia. And I repeat, everything depends on the results of the war in Ukraine. That is, today all of Russia's resources are focused on the destruction of Ukraine. If Russia achieves this goal, well, then its hands will be untied and it will switch to other subjects, including potentially Kazakhstan. Well, but we must understand that Kazakhstan is also not an easy target, because there is a sufficiently large population there, because there are also other interested subjects there. Well, plus this whole situation that is developing in the world today, well, I think it has sobered everyone up a little. And today everyone has begun to think about their security in the future and analyze who is the source of danger. And Russia, with such behavior, is increasingly encouraging even potentially friendly political regimes and mentally close ones. Yes, that is, autocracy. Frankly, autocracies, I don't know, Kaganates, Khanates, gang states, it is already scaring them and even they're already trying to find some mechanisms of restraint. Therefore, again, I state with all responsibility that Russia's position, well, it has seriously weakened and will weaken further. That is, this is an inevitable process and it is conditioned, again, not at all by the issue of language, not by the issue of religion. That is, these are only secondary factors that also play their role. And I will repeat that we still see, yes, these reviews about how in the same Georgia there is from time to time indignation at the behavior of Russians who do not want to adhere to local norms, do not want to learn local languages. Just like they came to the same Kazakhstan and started teaching Kazakhs what language Kazakhs should speak or how Kazakhs should behave. The situation is the same in Kyrgyzstan and Azerbaijan. There is a great Russian saying, "Be as at home, but don't forget that you are visiting." And they constantly, as in another order, say that they put a pig at the table, and sometimes on the table. This is about the Russians, that is, this is their truly chauvinistic rudeness. I wouldn't even call it imperial, because I can't even bring myself to call it imperial. This is not imperial, this is just chauvinistic rudeness. Well, of course, no one likes it, and it is clear that it reacts like in that joke. I don't know, you probably remember when we were in New York for 2 weeks, and the police still didn't speak Russian. Well, that is, this is the norm, that is, this is simply how people who speak Russian can behave, and when they want to say, "What, are you some kind of inferior?" they say, "What, are you not Russian?" There is definitely no longer a people in the world who uses the fact that everyone else, if you are not Russian, then you are not like that. Russian is the norm. Well, so what do you want from them? Well, here are the results of their behavior. But there is another interesting aspect that we have not yet touched on, or rather touched on in passing. Russia is a multinational and multi-confessional state. And there these internal and national contradictions are also growing, they are necessarily growing. I am sure that all this, well, sooner or later will also, well, tear Russia apart, because the Russians have not been able to develop any adequate national policy to date. Well, despite the fact that they constantly want to teach everyone else how to properly resolve the issue of peaceful coexistence of different religions or ethnic groups within the same state. Therefore, this situation with Azerbaijanis, well, this is just one separate case of this Russian rudeness, chauvinism and xenophobia.
Well, why do you say that you haven't developed a general policy? And what about it? And the policy of assimilation? Well, that is, what they do in the occupied territories, they do the same in their long-occupied territories. 30 seconds. You see, if they haven't been able to assimilate Ukrainians in 350 years,
Haven't swallowed them, the
Policy is not very effective. And they used all the most cruel repressive methods for that. That is, you have to understand that what you succeed in at some stage doesn't mean that it will work like that in the future, right? That is, when my ancestors were in Chechnya, there were no problems there. And now they have arisen, that is, although it also seemed that Chechnya had already been finally conquered, right? There were 2 Chechen wars only in modern times, and it turns out that it wasn't. Well, it turns out that the Russians are not happy with Chechnya. Well, that's all. So, have the Russians solved the problem with the Chechens? Yes. Allah is above us, Moscow is below us. If this is the solution to the problem, then there are no questions. I further accustom the Russians to all sorts of successes and to continue to so effectively solve problems not only with the Chechens, but also with many other ethnic groups. And finally, the dynamics of the development of the empire in general, when the empire at a certain stage benefits the one who creates it, and at a certain stage it begins to harm, because all these, roughly speaking, are the periphery, on the contrary, it begins to feed the metropolis. Well, that is, the Russians are not the first to go through this stage. Therefore, I am accustomed to successes and to continue to move in the same aspect. Valentin, thank you.